The night I stepped into Shadowpine Forest, I knew I might never return. My brother's life hung by a thread, and the villagers whispered that only the forbidden midnight bloom could save him, a flower that grew deep in the territory of the most feared creatures, wolves with eyes of gold and fangs of steel. I wasn't prepared for the Alpha King himself to corner me, his gaze burning through the darkness, warning me that he couldn't control himself, yet claiming me as if fate had chosen us both. Suddenly, I was no longer just human, no longer just a sister fighting for her brother. I was the girl with starlight in her veins, caught between worlds, walking a path of danger, desire, and destiny that would either unite two realms or destroy everything I loved. The night was colder than I had imagined, the kind of cold that sank into my bones and whispered that I didn't belong here. Yet I kept moving because Liam's face hovered in my mind like a lantern I couldn't extinguish, my brother's breaths shallow, his fever burning him away, and I knew if I didn't find the midnight bloom, he would slip from me forever. So I stepped past the tree line of shadow pine, each crunch of pine needles underfoot a betrayal of my presence, each heartbeat a thunderclap in my ears, and though my hands trembled, I gripped my mother's silver pendant, the one she pressed into my palm before she died, telling me it would remind me who I was, words that never made sense until tonight, for the metal pulsed with warmth as if alive, and I couldn't shake the thought that maybe it was warning me or guiding me, or both. But I clung to it anyway because it was all I had. No weapon, no courage beyond desperation, only this pendant and a love strong enough to march me straight into death. And as I walked deeper, the air thickened, damp with moss and secrets, shadows twisting into shapes that made my skin crawl, and the silence was broken only by the occasional flutter of wings or the groan of branches swaying high above, until a sound slithered through the stillness. Faint at first, but undeniable. The distant cry of a wolf, long and low, vibrating through the marrow of the earth, freezing me mid-step. For everyone in Duskwood Hollow knew what those cries meant, and still I forced my legs to move because fear could not outweigh love, not tonight, not when Liam's life hung by a thread, and so I pressed forward, whispering prayers under my breath, half to the moon, half to the memory of my mother, asking them both to shield me, though I knew neither could stand between me and what roamed here. And the deeper I went, the taller the trees grew, their roots sprawling like ike veins across the ground, snagging my boots, their branches clawing at the sky, blotting out the stars, and I thought of all the stories told around the hearth, how no one who crossed this border ever returned, how sometimes screams echoed back to the village on stormy nights, how wolves walked on two legs under the blood moon, their eyes burning gold, their claws dripping with human blood, and though I told myself they were only tales to keep children in line, the sweat on my palms said otherwise, my every nerve stretched thin as a bowstring, and the forest felt alive, aware, watching, as if the trees themselves bent their gaze upon me, whispering of the trespass I had committed. And yet I would not turn back, for love leaves no room for retreat, and Liam's weak voice echoed in my memory, begging me not to leave him, begging me to stay. But I couldn't, not when staying meant watching him die. So I pressed on, lantern long extinguished for fear its glow would draw eyes from the dark, guided only by the sickle of the moon casting pale light across the undergrowth, and with every step I felt the weight of unseen gazes pressing closer, my skin prickling, my breath shallow, and then the howl came again, closer this time, sharper, rattling through my ribs, forcing the air from my lungs, and I clutched the pendant tighter, the silver searing hot against my skin, almost painful, and I wondered if it was protecting me or cursing me, but I had no choice except to hold it as if it could anchor me against the storm gathering in the distance, and my mind flooded with memories. Liam chasing fireflies in the meadow, his laughter ringing through the twilight, his small hand clutching mine as we raced across the fields, his fevered eyes staring up at me only last night, whispering my name with what little strength he had left, and the thought of losing him struck harder than any woo. Left's teeth ever could, so I forced my legs to keep moving, weaving between the gnarled roots and the mist curling low across the forest floor. the scent of pine and damp earth mingling with something darker, something wild, a musk that made the hairs on my arms stand on end, and when I paused to listen, the silence seemed to hum with tension, the forest holding its breath, and I realized I was not alone. Something moved between the trees, silent but heavy, and I bit down hard on my lip to stop the cry from escaping, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't run. Not here, not now. So I kept walking, one step and then another, until my breath slowed into shallow gasps, and the shadows shifted again. A flash of movement at the corner of my vision, too quick to name, too close to dismiss, and the howl rose once more, closer, sharper, echoing through the canopy until the branches themselves seemed to shake, and in that instant, I knew the wolves had found me, knew the stories were not lies but warnings I had ignored, and the pendant throbbed hotter than ever, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my heart, as if alive, as if it too feared what prowled in the dark, and I whispered into the silence not for myself, but for Liam, pleading that if the forest was to take me, it would let him live, let him see another dawn, because I had come here not to survive, but to save. And if this was the price, then I would pay it, trembling in the maw of the shadows, while the wolves closed in, unseen yet undeniable, their presence pressing on me from all sides like a tide about to break. The shadows shifted around me, thick and suffocating, carrying the sound of movement I could not place, and I froze, clutching the pendant at my chest, feeling it pulse with warmth that seemed almost alive, and every step I had taken to reach this cursed clearing now seemed both reckless and inevitable, and I tried to swallow, but my throat was dry as sand, and the hairs on my arms rose, prickling under the gaze I could feel before I even saw him. And then he emerged from the darkness, tall, impossibly broad, a presence that seemed to command the very air, and the moonlight caught the edge of his features, sharp and terrifyingly beautiful, and my breath hitched as my eyes fell on his, golden and molten, and they held me like a predator holds its prey, and I realized I could not look away even if I wanted to, and my legs threatened to buckle beneath me, but some foolish, stubborn part of me rooted me to the earth, as if leaving now would be a betrayal, and I could hear my own heart hammering so loudly it seemed an insult to the quiet that surrounded us, and the forest itself felt silent in deference to him, the wind stilled in the trees as if the world had paused to watch this moment, and I tried to remember the stories, the warnings, the tales whispered around hearths in Duskwood Hollow, about Kaelen Draven, the Alpha King, whose name alone could curdle blood, and I wondered if those tales had captured even half of what it meant to stand before him, and my fingers tightened around the chain of my pendant, biting into my palm, and I whispered a prayer I didn't fully believe, but it was all I had, and the scent of his presence hit me, metallic and wild, a mix of danger and something intoxicating that I could not name, and I tried to step back, but the forest floor seemed to cling to my boots, tangling roots refusing to release me, and he shifted slightly, tilting his head, nostrils flaring, and the low rumble of a growl vibrated through the air, deep and rich and somehow personal, and it made my skin prickle and my stomach twist, and I wished for the courage I had never known, the courage my mother had possessed when she told me to find strength I couldn't yet see, and I felt the air between us thicken, heavy with unspoken power, and I wanted to speak, to explain, to beg, but my lips were frozen, my words trapped behind a wall of fear and awe, and the golden glow of his eyes seemed to penetrate my soul, seeing every secret I had tried to bury, every shadow of doubt and hope intertwined, and I felt exposed, vulnerable, but also inexplicably alive in a way I had never been, and he stepped closer, each movement deliberate, measured, like a storm contained by a single heartbeat, and I realized the forest itself seemed to shrink around him, the branches bending in deference to his presence, and I could hear my own breaths echoing in my ears, and they sounded weak, human, insufficient against what he was, and yet I could not flee, could not tear my gaze away from the fire that burned in him, and he tilted his head again, a movement both predatory and uncertain, and I sensed a conflict I could not name, a battle raging behind his eyes between instinct and restraint, and it terrified me as much as it intrigued me. And I thought of Liam, of the reason I had come here, of the midnight bloom waiting somewhere in this forest, and it gave me a fragile thread of courage to hold on to, even as my knees shook and my fingers threatened to drop the pendant, which now felt hotter, alive with energy I could not comprehend, and I realized he could smell it, sense it, and perhaps fear it. And the thought made my chest tighten, a strange, thrilling, suffocating mix of dread and anticipation, and he leaned closer, his presence pressing into me like a physical force, and I could feel the heat of him, the danger he carried, and the impossible truth that I was still alive despite being within his reach, and my mind screamed in contradiction, warning me to run, warning me to kneel, warning me that I was completely unprepared for what this encounter could mean. And yet I could not look away, could not flee, could not summon words that could justify my trespass, could only stand, shivering, hoping my courage would be enough. And he spoke, low and deliberate, his voice a growl that vibrated through my chest and made my blood freeze and burn simultaneously. "You shouldn't be here, human." And the words struck me with the weight of prophecy and Thrian. Eat intertwined, and I whispered, trembling, "I had no choice. My brother, he's dying." And my voice cracked under the strain, ragged and trembling, and for a heartbeat he seemed to weigh my words, to measure them against his own instincts, and his jaw flexed, a movement both animal and calculating, and I thought I might see the end in that instant, might fall to my knees beneath his scrutiny, but instead he merely exhaled sharply, the sound rumbling in the clearing like distant thunder, and I saw him wrestle with himself, the tension coiled in every muscle, and the growl softened, shifting in tone, and he said, "I should kill you, but I cannot." And my chest constricted with disbelief, my heart lurching, and I realized he was as unpredictable as the forest itself, and yet I sensed something deeper in his hesitation, a strange fascination, an instinct I could not name that tethered me to him as surely as the pendant pulsed against my skin, and I felt both relief and terror in equal measure, unable to reconcile the danger with the inexplicable spark igniting between us. And he stepped even closer, the heat of his body mingling with the cold of the night, pressing me against the reality that every step I had taken brought me here, and I was utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable, and utterly alive. And though my mind screamed to flee, my body betrayed me, standing rooted as though drawn by some unseen force, and the forest seemed to hum around us, trees swaying like sentinels observing a moment of profound reckoning. And I realized that in this gaze, in this moment, nothing would ever be the same. And I was trembling not just from fear, but from an emotion I dared not name, a thrilling, terrifying recognition that something powerful, dangerous, and irreversible had begun, and the gold of his eyes held me in place, captured, claimed, and in that moment I understood why my her's words had mattered, why the pendant had burned, why I had been compelled to walk into the forest despite every warning. Because all of this fear, this danger, this wild, impossible connection was only the beginning, and I knew, with a certainty that struck me deeper than any fear, that my life had irrevocably changed the moment Kaelen Draven stepped from the shadows and found me, and I could feel my pulse in every vein, in every breath, in every trembling inch of skin, alive with the dangerous electricity that crackled between us, and I whispered into the night, into the forest, into the space that held us both, a single fragile thought. If he did not kill me tonight, if I survived this moment, then nothing would ever be simple again, and I would never forget the way his eyes had pinned me to the earth, had stripped away pretense and fear, leaving me exposed, shivering, and aware that desire and terror could coexist in a single heartbeat. And I could not name which frightened me more, the possibility of death or the impossible, searing connection that seemed to blaze between us. And so I stood and waited and trembled and hoped that whatever came next, I could survive it. The forest seemed to hold its breath as he lingered close, golden eyes never leaving mine, and I could feel the weight of him pressing against every nerve, every thought I had ever known dissolving under the intensity of his gaze, and I realized my own pulse had become a drumbeat in the quiet, loud enough that I imagined he could hear it, and my fingers ached from gripping the pendant so tightly that the chain bit into my palm, and still he did not strike, still he did not move away, and I wondered if he too was caught in the same impossible tangle of instinct and hesitation, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying scents I could not name, earthy and wild, danger laced with an almost intoxicating musk that made my head spin, and I tried to steady my breathing, to tell myself that all I had to do was survive, that my brother needed me, that my courage mattered more than fear, and yet my body refused to obey, legs trembling, chest tight, heart pounding so hard I feared it might burst, and he leaned just slightly, enough that the heat of his presence brushed against my skin, and a shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold, and I realized with a jolt that the stories of his cruelty did not prepare anyone for the way he made a human feel completely seen and exposed at the same time, and I tried to speak, to form words, but all I could manage was a whisper, raw and trembling. Why? Why are you not killing me? And he tilted his head, golden eyes narrowing, a flicker of something almost like humor crossing his features before it disappeared, and his voice came, low, measured, vibrating through my chest in a way that made me aware of every breath and every heartbeat, because I do not know if I want to. And I swallowed hard, a lump rising in my throat, and the pendant at my chest warmed hotter still, burning with a pulse that seemed to echo the tension between us, and I could feel a pull, magnetic and terrifying, that drew me toward him even as every instinct screamed to flee, and the shadows around us seemed to grow thicker, pressing in, making the space between us electric and alive, and I tried to take a step back, only to feel the forest grip my boots, roots snaring me like it too wanted me to face this impossible moment, and he shifted closer again, subtle, deliberate, each movement a study in power and control, and I imagined the stories of villagers who had entered Shadowpine and never returned, and yet here I was, trembling but still standing, and I realized the fear that had driven me this far was mingling with something I could not name, a thrill and a shiver, and a dangerous pull that both terrified and enthralled me, and I wondered if he could sense it too, if the flicker of my defiance, my courage, my hum, and fragility was part of what kept him from ending me, and I wished I could read his mind, even knowing I should not, even knowing it would destroy me to know the truth, and yet the ache to understand him, to understand the tension crackling between us, was irresistible, and I clenched the pendant tighter, feeling the burn of metal against my skin, wishing it could shield me from what I did not yet understand, and he exhaled slowly, almost as if he had been holding his breath the entire time, and the growl that rumbled low in his throat softened, a sound almost human, almost tender, and I realized that every instinct he had as a predator was at war with something else, something I could not name, and I felt my own instincts mirror his, a pull between fear and fascination, terror and inexplicable desire, and my lips parted, trembling, and I tried to steady my voice. I I only want to save him. And the word left me more a whisper than a sentence, yet he seemed to hear it fully, his eyes softening ever so slightly, though the fire behind them never dimmed, and the space between us felt charged, alive, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for some inevitable spark. And I wanted to move, to flee, to fall to the earth, to do anything except remain so exposed, so alive under the weight of him, and yet I could not. And I realized then that this moment, this impossibly suspended moment, had changed everything. And though fear still gripped me, and though every sense screamed danger, there was a thrill, an awareness of life so sharp it hurt, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as he took another step, golden eyes locking with mine, and he whispered, rough and low, "You have no idea what you've done by coming here." And yet it was not a threat, not entirely, but a recognition, an acknowledgement of the power I had unknowingly carried into his domain, and I realized then that the forest, the night, the howl of distant wolves, and every whispered warning my village had ever given me had led me here, to this impossible collision of human fragility and wolf strength, and I understood that I would never be the same again, that my heart would never forgive me if I turned away now, and my hands ached, my chest heaved, my mind raced with every fear and every spark of forbidden exhilaration, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, tears of terror and awe and some foolish, foolish hope, and he watched me, silent, golden eyes unblinking, and I realized that whatever he felt, whatever war raged inside him, I had survived the first moment, and that in itself was a victory, precarious, trembling, and impossible, and yet real. And as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and something darker, something alive, I understood that the bond of this encounter, the spark that had ignited between us in the silence of the forest, would not fade, and I shivered again, both from fear and from something else, something deep and dangerous, and I whispered, almost to myself, "If I survive this, I will never be the same." And the golden eyes did not look away, and in that refusal to look away, I felt the first pulse of something I could not name, something that would follow me beyond this night, beyond this forest, beyond every instinct that had brought me here, and I knew, with a certainty that made my chest tighten and my pulse race, that the moment Kaelen Draven found me, in the shadows, breathing, trembling, alive, nothing would ever be the same again, and every shiver that ran through me, every pulse of heat and terror and fascination, told me that this was only the beginning of a journey I could not yet comprehend, and I was already lost to it, already bound by it, and I could not run even if I wanted to, because he had marked me in ways I could not yet name, ways deeper than any bite, any scar, any fear, and I stood there, trembling, alive, waiting, and knowing, impossibly, that this encounter had changed me forever. The moment I realized I was no longer alone in the clearing, the shadows shifted with a weight I could not resist, and before I could even take a step, rough hands gripped my arms and yanked me off the forest floor, pulling me through the tangle of roots and mist, like I weighed nothing, and my scream caught in my throat, stifled by the fear that I had crossed into a world I could not escape, and the trees blurred past me as I was carried deeper into the forest, the scent of wet earth and wild fur filling my senses, and my heart hammered in my chest as panic threatened to overtake me, my legs kicking futilely, my voice breaking as I cried out for Kaelen, even though I wasn't sure if he was friend or predator, and the moon above seemed to twist through the branches, its light flickering and silvering, and the pendant at my chest flared hotter than ever, searing against my skin, and I felt it pulse in rhythm with my terror, and the wolves around me were silent except for the soft padding of paws on moss, yet their presence pressed on me like a living wall, and I realized with a jolt that the Alpha King's influence, his golden gaze, had not left me, had lingered like a shadow even now, and I wondered if he knew where I was, if he watched, if he would intervene, and I bit my lip until it bled, tasting iron as my panic surged, and the air smelled of damp pine and fir and something older, something deeper, something that carried power in the way the wind carried storm clouds, and I felt my stomach twist as the forest opened into a wide clearing, lit by the full glow of the moon, and there they were, standing in a circle, the elders of the pack, immense and regal, their forms towering and rigid, and my breath caught in my throat as I realized I was surrounded, every escape route sealed, and the pendant at my chest pulsed wildly, a searing silver light that seemed to draw the attention of every wolf in the circle, their eyes reflecting it like fire in polished obsidian, and whispers rippled through the assembly, low and trembling, like the rustle of leaves in a storm. And I caught fragments, the prophecy, the girl with starlight, fate tied to blood and moonlight, and my heart thundered as the words sank into my mind, alien and terrifying and beautiful all at once, and I felt my knees weaken under the weight of it, under the significance of the moment, under the knowledge that I had been pulled into a destiny far larger than myself, and a voice cut through the murmurs, sharp, cruel, resonant with authority and disdain. Ronan Vare, stepping forward from the shadows, his eyes dark with fury and contempt, pointing at me as though I were the source of every ill in the world, and his voice rang clear across the moonlit clearing, declaring me a curse, a threat, a danger to all that the pack had built, and I felt the cold spike of fear as all eyes turned to me, judging, measuring, waiting for my response, and the silver of the pendant blazed brighter, flaring against my chest, throwing streaks of light across the elders' faces, and the air hummed with power as if the forest itself was responding. And I realized I could feel the pulse of it, a rhythm that connected me to something greater, something ancient and terrible. And I saw Kaelen step forward, emerging from the edge of the shadows, golden eyes glinting like molten metal in the moonlight. And my chest tightened, my heart stuttering in recognition of the man who had spared me, who had burned his instincts to leave me alive, who now stood poised between me and the threat. And I could feel the tension coil around him like a spring, lethal and protective all at once, and he raised his head high, shoulders square, presence immense, and the other wolves seemed to shrink back in response, the power of his aura tangible, pressing against every nerve, and he walked forward, deliberate, measured, placing himself between me and Ronan, the predator and the predator, and I felt the brush of his arm against mine, subtle, electrifying, grounding me even as my mind spun, and his voice, low and commanding, rumbled across the clearing, declaring that I belonged to him, claiming me with words heavier than chains, with a power that bound my fate to his, and I felt something strange and impossible in that moment. Fear and relief, and something warmer and more dangerous, like fire coiling in my veins. And the pendant flared again, almost violently, as if acknowledging his claim, as if recognizing the binding of fates. And Ronan's eyes blazed with fury, his jaw tight. But even he hesitated under the force of Kaelin's assertion, and I stood there, trembling, my chest rising and falling with the tension, aware that I was at the center of a storm, my life hanging in balance, my destiny rewritten in a single breath. And yet I could not stop staring at Kaelen, at the golden eyes that held me, that protected me, that warned me of danger and desire in the same moment, and I felt a pulse of heat between us, something intimate and forbidden and terrifying. And the elders whispered again, their voices rising and falling like waves, speaking of prophecy and fate and a girl with starlight in her veins, and I felt the weight of their attention, their judgment, their awe. And I realized that every step, every choice, every heartbeat had led me here, and I was powerless to stop it. And the silver light of the pendant threw strange shadows across the clearing, casting me as both victim and chosen one, and Kaelin's hand hovered near mine, not touching, not yet, but close enough to make the blood in my veins roar with something I could not name. And Ronan's growl shook the air, filled with menace, with threat, with challenge, and yet Kaelen remained steady, unyielding, protective, claiming me and marking the line between danger and safety. And I realized in a sharp, breathtaking instant that my life was no longer my own, that I was bound to this man and this pack in ways I could not yet understand, and the pendant pulsed hotter still, and I could feel the silver fire echoing through all my chest, through my blood, through my very soul, and I knew that the elders, the wolves, even the moon itself, had witnessed the binding, had recognized the shift, and I shivered, trembling not just from fear, but from the thrill and the danger of the moment, from the impossible, electric tension that connected Kaelen and me. And I felt my knees weaken, my breath shallow, my chest tight, but I could not look away from his eyes, golden and fierce and impossibly alive, and I understood that this was only the beginning, that nothing would ever be the same, that fate had chosen, and I was at its center, and the forest, the pack, the moon, the pendant, Kaelen himself, all conspired to mark me, to bind me, to ignite a spark that was equal parts terrifying and breathtaking. and I knew that every heartbeat from now on would carry the memory of this moment, the claim, the flare of silver, the whispers of prophecy, the challenge in Ronan's eyes, and the protective, dangerous fire in Kaelen's, and I trembled and breathed and felt the impossible weight of destiny settle upon me, and yet I was alive, and I was seen, and I was marked, and for the first time I realized that my life had irrevocably changed, and that I would never, ever be the same again. The pack around me seemed alive, breathing as one entity, every pair of eyes fixed on me, the silver flare of my pendant casting strange reflections across the clearing, making shadows dance along the faces of the elders who whispered in tones that were both fearful and reverent. And I felt the weight of their attention pressing against my shoulders, heavier than the chains that held me in place. And I realized that every heartbeat, every shiver, every tremble of my limbs was observed, measured, dissected for signs of weakness or strength, and I clenched the pendant so tightly that my knuckles ached, but it pulsed in my grip. Most as if it understood my fear and my defiance. And Kaelen's presence was a tether, a lifeline, pressing against me with the gravity of a storm contained, and I could feel his gaze like fire, golden and fierce, as though he could see every secret, every thought, every shadow of doubt and hope inside me. And the whispers of the elders rose, weaving tales of prophecy and destiny around my ears, murmuring about the girl with starlight in her veins, about choices that could unite or destroy, about fates entwined with blood and moonlight, and I shivered, realizing that I was no longer merely human, no longer merely a girl from Duskwood Hollow, who had walked blindly into danger. And yet, even as the fear threatened to overtake me, a flicker of defiance stirred, fragile and trembling, igniting in my chest with a warmth that seemed borrowed from the silver of my pendant. And Ronan Vare stepped forward, his voice slicing the night like a blade, declaring me a curse, calling me dangerous, calling me unnatural, and I felt my stomach twist with the cruelty in his words, and every wolf around him tensed, some sneering, some watching with cautious interest, and I understood the magnitude of what I faced, that this was not simply a test of courage, but of survival, of identity, of the choices I would make. And the silver light of the pendant pulsed again, stronger this time, flaring and weaving across the clearing, and I felt heat crawl across my chest and through my veins, and a low hum seemed to vibrate in my bones, like the earth itself was resonating with the power inside me. And Kaelen moved closer, his hand brushing mine ever so slightly, just enough to remind me that he was here, that he claimed me, that I was bound to him now in a way that defied words, and I felt the pull of it, magnetic and undeniable, drawing me to him even as fear and awe and wonder collided inside me. And the pack elders shifted, their eyes narrowing and widening, murmuring amongst themselves, debating, judging, weighing the silver flare and my presence against ancient prophecies. They had died their whole lives, and I could hear the tension ripple through the air, thick and almost tangible, pressing against my chest so that breathing felt like a luxury. And Kaelen's golden gaze never left mine, and in that gaze I saw his conflict, the constant tug between instinct and restraint, the war between his wolf and his human-like conscience, and I realized that even he was bound by rules, by pride, by tradition. And yet he had chosen to stand with me, to claim me, to tether my fate to his, and the thought both thrilled and terrified me, and I clenched the chain of my pendant tighter, feeling the burn of metal against my skin, feeling the pulse of power beneath it, feeling the impossible reality that I was no longer merely a girl, but a symbol, a pivot, a bridge between worlds, and Ronan's growl cut through my reverie, jagged and dangerous, sharp as knives, and he gestured wildly, his hands slicing through the air, calling me abomination, calling me unnatural, calling me unworthy, and the wolves around him bristled, some snarling, some whispering, and I realized that this was a test not just of strength, but of choice, and I swallowed the lump in my throat, focusing on the heat of Kaelen's presence, the certainty in his stance, the protective shield he formed around me simply by existing and claiming me. and the silver of the pendant flared once more, lighting the night with a brilliance that forced every eye to turn to me, forcing every whisper to hush, forcing every doubt to pause, and I felt my body tremble, a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and something more, something unnameable, something that made my pulse quicken, even as it threatened to betray me. And Kaelin's voice rose then, low and commanding, carrying over the whispers of the pack, cutting through the tension like a blade, declaring that I belonged to him, that I was under his protection, that any heart's am coming to me would be answered with the fury of the Alpha, and I felt the impossible weight of his words settle on my shoulders, grounding me even as my heart fluttered wildly, and the pack shifted, some stepping back, some glaring, all aware that the balance of power had shifted with a single claim, and I felt heat race through me, terrifying and exhilarating, a rush of life and danger, of vulnerability and safety, all wrapped in the single act of being claimed. And I understood that in this moment, fate had chosen, destiny had moved, and I had survived, marked and recognized, and the whispers rose again, not with fear, but with awe, and I realized that my role in the prophecy had begun, that the silver light, the moon, Kaelin's claim, and my own courage were threads in a tapestry I could not yet see, but that would shape every heartbeat from this night onward. And my knees ached, my chest heaved, my hands burned from gripping the pendant, my breath came in shallow gasps, and yet I stood, trembling but unbroken, alive in the center of power and prophecy, caught between fear and fascination, danger and desire, and I knew with a clarity that burned that my life was no longer mine, that I was tethered to Kaelen, to the pack, to the moonlit destiny that would not release me. And as he remained at my side, golden eyes unyielding, my chest swelled with a strange, fierce pride, a pulse of courage that came not from strength, but from survival and recognition and the impossible knowledge that I had been chosen, claimed, and bound. And in that moment, the forest seemed to breathe with us, the silver light of the pendant reflected in every eye, casting shadows that twisted like smoke, and I realized that the night, the wolves, Kaelen, the prophecy, the silver fire within me, were no longer elements of fear alone, but of power, of connection, of a bond that defied instinct, reason, and fear. And as I breathed, trembling, alive, and watched Kaelen stand firm, claiming me, protecting me, tethering my fate to his, I understood that my journey had truly begun, that nothing would ever be the same, that I was no longer merely human, and that the silver pendant had flared for the first time not as a warning, but as a herald of what I was becoming, and I shivered in the moonlight, trembling, afraid, exhilarated, and utterly alive. The first sensation I became aware of was cold stone beneath my fingers, and then the faint echo of my own ragged breaths bouncing against the walls of what I realized was a chamber, dimly lit by torches that flickered with shadows that danced across the walls. And I blinked against the haze of exhaustion and terror, trying to remember where I was, trying to remember the forest, the pendant, Kaelen, the flares of silver and gold that had marked me, and I felt the weight of everything I had survived pressing against my ribs, chest tight, heart hammering, and the faint scent of herbs and earth drifted toward me, grounding me in a place that was both alien and strangely familiar. And I realized that I was no longer in the forest, no longer in danger from the wolves' immediate claws, and yet the tension in my muscles would not ease, and I pushed myself up on trembling arms, legs weak beneath me, and saw the chamber in full. Walls carved from stone that glowed faintly under the torchlight, tapestries depicting wolves and moons and battles long past, and the air smelled of incense and herbs, strange and calming and sharp at once, and I could hear the faint hum of activity outside, murmurs and the shuffle of heavy boots, and I wondered if Kaelen was nearby, if he watched, if he had left me here to contemplate my fate. And then a figure entered, moving with quiet authority, steps soft yet deliberate, and I realized it was a woman, older than I expected, with silver-streaked hair pulled back, eyes sharp yet gentle, and a presence that made the room feel safer even as my body still trembled, and she studied me with an intense pity that made me want to shrink and yet also trust her, and she spoke, her voice low, steady, carrying a warmth I had not expected in this fortress of wolves. "You are awake," she said, and I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, my voice dry and fragile, and she stepped closer, placing a hand near my pendant, though not touching it, and I felt the warmth of her gaze and the subtle authority in her posture. And she introduced herself as Aria, healer of the pack, and I felt my pulse quicken, trying to comprehend how I had been brought here, why I had survived, why someone in this pack, beyond Kaelen, might be capable of kindness. And she watched me carefully, then spoke again, telling me that she once knew my mother, Celine, and the words struck me like lightning, jagged and impossible, because I had never known anyone in this world who had known her, and yet here was proof. Here was a living thread connecting me to the past I had only glimpsed through stories and a pendant pressed into my palm years before her death, and I felt a sharp ache, a longing for what had been lost, for guidance I had never received, and yet Era's presence was soothing, grounding, making the cold stones of this chamber feel less alien, and she spoke of my blood, of the truth I had yet to fully understand, that I was not entirely human, that the wolf within me, dormant for so long, now stirred in response to the pendant, the moon, the claim, and the danger I had faced, and I felt a shiver of fear and awe, realizing that the stories my village had told of wolves and humans, of predator and prey, no longer fit neatly into any box, and that I was both, and that this truth was mine to navigate, mine to bear, and mine alone. And Aria watched my reaction closely, her expression calm but knowing, and I felt the weight of her understanding pressing against my shoulders, and I wondered if she could see the confusion, the terror, the fascination, the longing in my eyes. And she spoke again, softly this time, telling me that my mother had made choices, dangerous choices, choices that had led to love and exile and a legacy now resting on me. And the words stirred something deep in me, something both terrifying and beautiful, like fire coiling in my chest, and I realized I had never considered the consequences of being marked, of surviving, of being claimed, and the room seemed to shrink around me, the stone walls pressing closer, the torches flickering with shadows that danced like ancient spirits, and I felt my fingers curl around the chain of the pendant, trying to anchor myself, and yet, even as I held it, warmth flaring, I felt the pull of the wolf inside me, a pulse that mirrored my own, and I understood that the strength, the danger, the legacy, the destiny of my mother now flowed in me, and I was not prepared. I was not ready, yet I could not turn away, could not deny the blood and fire that marked me. And Aria knelt slightly, meeting my eyes directly, saying that it was my choice, my path, whether to walk it bravely or falter in fear. And I felt a trembling weight of responsibility press on me, heavier than any stone or chain, heavier than the forest, heavier than Kaelen's golden gaze had ever been, and I realized that choosing this path might mean betraying everything I had known, my people, my village, the life I had thought I could cling to. And yet the pulse of my wolf blood, the silver flare of the pendant, the memory of my mother's words whispered in my hand, all demanded that I take the path before me, and my chest ached with longing and fear, desire and duty, and I could not separate them. And I realized that nothing would ever be simple again, that my life had been irrevocably changed the moment I had crossed into Shadowpine Forest, that every heartbeat, every thought, every choice had led me here, to the chamber of stone and herbs, to Aria, to Kaelen, to the pulse of destiny. And as I sat trembling, trying to breathe, trying to reconcile my human heart with the awakening wolf, trying to decide who I was and who I would become, I knew that this was the first real test, the beginning of understanding, the first step toward a future that was uncertain, terrifying, and possibly beautiful. And I clenched the pendant one last time, feeling the warmth of my mother, the heat of the moon, and the pull of something older and greater than fear, and I realized that whatever choice I made now, whatever path I took, I would never walk it alone, and the room felt alive with possibility and peril, and I trembled, and I breathed, and I accepted, in the quietest, most fragile way, that I was no longer merely Aria Hale, village girl, sister desperate to save her brother, but something more, something powerful, something bound to destiny, to the wolf, to Kaelen, and to the path my mother had left for me. And as I sat there, the torchlight flickering across my face, silver pendant warm against my chest, I understood that the true trial had only just begun. The moment I stepped into the ceremonial chamber, the air thick with incense and the metallic tang of anticipation, my pulse raced as if it wanted to break free from my chest, and the pack formed a wide circle around the sacred stone, eyes gleaming in the torchlight, golden, silver, dark, all staring at me as if I were both prey and chosen, and I felt my knees quake beneath me, hands trembling as I approached the stone, the silver pendant against my chest pulsing like a heartbeat. I could feel in every vein, and the weight of destiny pressed down with a force that made it almost hard to breathe. And Darian, the scarred warrior, stepped forward, jaw tight, eyes dark with disdain, and every fiber of him radiated distrust, as if my very presence offended the law of the pack, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady my shaking hands, my chest tight, throat dry, heart thrumming like a drum in the silence of the hall, and I felt Kaelin's gaze on me, a tether of warmth and warning, fierce and protective, and yet I could sense the tension in his posture, the pull between instinct and restraint, the power of an alpha held back only by his will, and I knew that every eye in the circle was on me, measuring, judging, waiting for the first drop of blood to fall, and I bent my fingers over the ceremonial blade, cold and sharp against my skin, and my pulse shot to my ears, and I cut my palm, pain sharp and immediate, a hot, searing shock that made me gasp, and the blood arced toward the stone, droplets scattering like ruby sparks across its surface. And then it happened. The silver fire erupted, spilling from the stone in sheets of light that reflected in every eye, blinding and brilliant. And I felt heat wash over me, even though I was not burned, and the chamber filled with gasps and murmurs, some in awe, some in fear, some in reverence, and I could hear the shift in the pack, the low rumble of murmured questions, the hissed exclamations, the sounds of wolves kneeling, others recoiling, the energy in the room twisting and alive, almost sentient, and I stood there, trembling, my blood still warm, my chest heaving, heart pounding, and the fire of the stone mirrored the fire rising within me, the power of the ritual, the surge of something wild and ancient stirring in my veins, and I felt the wolf awaken, deep and raw, coiling like lightning through every nerve, and Darian's scowl darkened further, jaw tightening as though the light offended him, as though I was both challenge and blasphemy to him, and yet even as he glared, I sensed a ripple of hesitation, a flicker of doubt, a recognition buried deep that this girl, trembling and human and wolf-blooded, was something more than either of us had expected, and the whispers rose again among the elders, reverent and hushed, speaking of prophecy and starlight in the veins, of fates entwined with blood and moonlight, and I felt every word reverberate inside me, weighty, undeniable, transforming the fear into something else, a fragile, fierce courage that coiled tight like the fire on the stone. And Kaelin's golden gaze never left me, steady and molten, a lighthouse in a storm of light and shadow and destiny. And I realized that the Alpha's claim, the pendant, the ritual, were all threads weaving me into a tapestry I could not yet see, but could feel in every pulse, every tremble, every breath. And my palms stung, red and raw, the pain grounding me as much as the silver fire, and the energy in the room hummed, thick and tangible, almost alive, and I felt the eyes of every wolf on me, seeing not just a girl, but a bridge, a fulcrum, a turning point, a force that could unite or destroy, and the fire reflected in Darian's eyes, narrowing, sharpening, Yet there was something else, a flicker of something buried under anger and pride, and I felt my chest tighten at the awareness of it, and I realized that in this moment I was no longer just human, no longer just Aria Hale from Duskwood Hollow, no longer just a sister desperate to save Liam, but a symbol, a pivot of fate, a girl with starlight coursing in her veins, and the knowledge both thrilled and terrified me, and I could feel the pack shifting, some kneeling, heads bowed in awe or fear, others recoiling, stepping back from the flare of silver light, the heat of the ritual, the weight of prophecy made manifest. And I breathed in the incense and the metallic tang of blood and fire, trying to steady, trying to ground myself, and I felt Kaelen step closer, warmth brushing against me, subtle yet undeniable, his presence a shield, a tether, a promise, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest, a pulse of something wild and intimate, forbidden and electric, and I clenched the pendant once more, feeling it pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, with the fire of the stone, with the awakening wolf in my blood, and I realized that every nerve, every pulse, every breath was tethered to the magic, to the prophecy, to the pack, to Kaelen, and the silver light danced across the faces of the elders, their expressions awed, fearful, rent, and I knew in that moment that I had become something extraordinary, that my life had been irrevocably changed, that fear and courage and destiny were intertwined in every fiber of me, and I shivered, trembling, alive with the energy of the ritual, with the knowledge that the wolf inside me had awakened, that I was no longer just a girl from Duskwood Hollow, but a creature of prophecy, of starlight and blood, bound to Kaelen, bound to the pack, bound to a fate I could not yet fully comprehend. And as the fire of the stone mirrored the fire within me, as the silver light pulsed in waves across the chamber, as Darian's gaze flickered with something I could not yet name, and as Kaelin's golden eyes held me, molten and fierce and protective, I realized that I had taken my first real step into a destiny that was terrifying, overwhelming, and breathtaking all at once, and that nothing would ever be the same, and I was ready, trembling and terrified and exhilarated, to see where this path would take me, to embrace the wolf and the girl, the blood and the starlight, the fear and the fire, the power and the choice, knowing that I had begun a journey from which I could never turn back, and yet feeling alive in every pulse, every breath, every heartbeat, every shimmer of silver fire on the sacred stone, the rite of blood and flame complete in its first spark, and I shivered, my chest tight, my hands still warm from the blood, and I knew that the prophecy had begun, and that I, Aria Hale, girl of starlight and blood, was at the center of it all, trembling, alive, and utterly transformed. The moment the circle of wolves tightened around me again, the air thick with tension, and the lingering scent of blood and fire from the ritual, I felt a cold dread seep into my bones, heavier than the stones beneath my feet, heavier than the silver light that still lingered in my chest, and then Ronan stepped forward, his presence a shadow that seemed to darken the chamber itself, his eyes glinting with malice, jaw set in a hard line, and I felt the shiver run down my spine as he opened his mouth, voice sharp and slicing through the silence like a blade, declaring me dangerous, unnatural, unworthy, and the pack reacted instantly, some stiffening, some whispering, some letting fear etch across their features like ink on parchment, and I felt every heartbeat, every tremor, every pulse of air press against me, as though the room itself were holding its breath, and Ronan's words wrapped around me like chains, each syllable a weight, each accusation a knife, and I tried to swallow, to steady myself, to breathe, but the fear coiled tight in my chest, a twisting, gnawing knot of dread and disbelief, and then he gestured, dramatic and cruel, and the shadows parted to reveal a boy, bound and trembling, eyes wide with terror, and I froze, my heart hammering so violently that I was certain it would burst through my ribs, and I recognized him immediately. Daniel, from my village, the boy whose laughter had echoed through the streets, whose hands I had seen help carry baskets, whose eyes now pleaded for mercy, and I staggered back a step, mouth dry, mind spinning with disbelief, terror, and a sudden surge of fury, and the pack murmured again, whispers like wind rustling through leaves, awe and fear mingling, some taking a cautious step closer, some recoiling from the tension, and I could feel Kaelen behind me, a solid, molten presence, every muscle taut, golden eyes fixed on Ronan, silent warning burning in their depth, and I realized that the choice I was about to face was nothing like the rituals, the flares of silver, the awakening of the wolf. I was about to confront cruelty, loyalty, and morality all at once, and my chest felt tight, lungs burning as my mind raced, imagining Daniel's fear, imagining the consequences of failure, imagining the weight of the pack's judgment, and yet even in the whirl of panic, there was a spark of determination, a stubborn and flame that refused to be snuffed, a knowledge deep in my blood that I had to protect him, that compassion was not weakness, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice, trying to summon courage from somewhere I had never known I possessed. And Ronan's smile was cruel, sharp, predatory, as he continued, manipulating the murmurs, twisting fear into a weapon, pointing out every human flaw, every weakness, every reason to doubt me. And the room seemed to tighten, walls closing in, the torchlight casting long, dancing shadows, and the scent of sweat and adrenaline mixed with incense and blood, making my head spin, making the world seem unreal. And yet Daniel's eyes, wide and terrified, pinned me, anchoring me, giving me purpose, giving me the resolve I needed, and I felt the wolf inside me stir, coiling and raw, hungry and protective, a pulse I could not ignore, a pull toward the boy, toward justice, toward mercy, toward the impossible path, and Darien, the scarred warrior, shifted slightly, eyes narrowing, jaw tightening, and I sensed the flicker of doubt in him, the recognition that my choices now carried weight, and the pack around us tensed, murmurs rising and falling like waves, some whispering of prophecy, some trembling at the tension, some gripping the edges of instinct and law, and I felt Kaelen move subtly, a hand brushing mine in warning, grounding, tethering me, a silent promise that he would not let them break me, and yet he could not take the choice from me, could not make the decision that now burned in my chest with every heartbeat, and I swallowed the lump in my throat, feeling the fire of the ritual from before still pulsing, a thread connecting my courage to my awakening wolf, to the silver light that had marked me, to destiny that now demanded action, and I realized that Ronan was testing more than my loyalty to him, more than my obedience to the pack. He was testing my very morality, my capacity to uphold life against cruelty, to defy fear with compassion, to choose a path that few would dare, and my hands shook, and my chest tightened. And yet I stepped forward, eyes on Daniel, heart hammering, wolf stirring, and I raised my voice, trembling but strong, saying that cruelty was not strength, that true power came from protecting the innocent, that the prophecy of starlight in my veins was not a tool for fear, but a symbol of hope, and the room fell almost silent, the murmurs halting as the force of my words rippled through the pack, and I saw eyes shift, some skeptical, some thoughtful, some questioning, and I felt the heat of adrenaline surge, my wolf growling low in my chest, my heart entwined with purpose, and Ronan's expression darkened, jaw tightening, and yet there was a flicker, a crack in his perfect mask, a hint that my defiance had reached even him, and Darian's gaze softened minutely, a grudging respect flickering in the depths, the pack around us feeling the tension, the precarious balance between fear and awe, and Kaelin's golden eyes held mine, molten, protective, fierce, a tether I could cling to, grounding me as I realized that the choice was mine, and mine alone, that the life of the boy depended on courage and compassion, and I felt every breath, every heartbeat, every flicker of silver light from the pendant resonate within me, and I stepped fully into the circle, chest heaving, wolf coiling, heart blazing, And I said again, voice steadier now, that I would not allow cruelty to dictate fate, that Daniel would live, that I would not bow to fear, and the murmurs spread, waves of tension rolling outward, some wolves kneeling, some stepping back, some eyes wide with awe, and Ronan's hand clenched at his side, his lips tight, and yet even he could not break the resolve that pulsed in me, and I felt my hands trembling, blood from earlier rituals still warm in memory, wolf pulsing with power, silver pendant heating against my chest, and I knew that this moment defined me, that fear and core, age, human and wolf, destiny and choice converged in a single heartbeat. And as the air seemed to crackle with the tension of all eyes upon me, I understood that my life, Daniel's life, and the fate of the pack were intertwined with the courage I summoned in that instant, that the prophecy, the starlight, the wolf, Kaelen, and the human girl were all one, and that my choice would echo far beyond this chamber, far beyond this night, and I felt the impossible weight of it, and the impossible thrill, the terror and the fire, the raw, fierce pulse of life and destiny, and I realized in that shiver of adrenaline, fear, and courage that I was ready, trembling, terrified, alive, and utterly bound to the impossible path I had chosen, that of mercy, defiance, and the unbreakable bond of purpose and destiny, and I would not fail, and the pack would know it, and the wolf within me roared, coiled, and surged, and I knew the trial of hearts had begun. The moment I realized Ronan intended to make me choose between my people and the pack, a cold, hollow dread settled deep in my chest, heavier than anything I had felt in the forest, and my pulse spiked, my heart hammering like a war drum as every wolf's gaze seemed to pierce through me, judging, waiting, daring me to falter, and Daniel, trembling, eyes wide and panicked, clutched the rope binding his wrists, his small body shivering with fear, and I felt the surge of protectiveness ignite in me like wildfire, coiling tight in my veins, and I stepped in front of him without thinking, my hands trembling, my voice shaking yet strong as I declared that compassion was not weakness, that cruelty was not strength, that I would not allow harm to be done to him, and the room went tense, silent but for the faint hiss of the torches and the low growl of some wolves in descent, and I could feel Darian watching, his scarred face tight with something I could not name yet, suspicion and curiosity battling within him, and Kaelin's golden gaze bore into Ronan, molten and fierce, a silent warning, and I felt the weight of that look, both terrifying and grounding, and I knew he would act if I faltered, yet the responsibility was mine to hold, mine to decide, mine to carry, and I swallowed the lump in my throat, feeling the blood from the ritual still warm in my veins, the wolf inside me coiling and raw, ready to defend. And I stepped closer to Daniel, wrapping a protective arm around him, heart pounding, pulse hammering, every nerve alight with tension, and Ronan's eyes narrowed, jaw tight, lips pressing into a hard line, and I realized he wanted to break me, to force me into submission, to make me betray everything I held dear, and yet even as fear clawed at me, courage flared, stubborn, fierce, unstoppable, and I raised my voice again, declaring my loyalty to life, to compassion, to mercy, and I felt the stirrings of power, raw and ancient, pulse through me, light flaring in my pendant as if my mother's spirit whispered strength, and the room seemed to shimmer, some wolves kneeling, some recoiling, murmurs rising and falling like waves, and Darian's eyes flickered, a grudging respect forming in the depths, while Ronan's hand clenched at his side, knuckles white, tension radiating from him in waves, and Kaelen shifted, golden eyes molten, body coiled like a spring, protective energy flowing toward me, warning me silently that he would act if my defiance alone could not hold. And I felt the weight of every choice pressing down, every heartbeat screaming the impossibility of what I was doing, yet I could not step back, could not allow fear to dictate fate, and I pressed myself closer to Daniel, feeling the heat of his small body, the tremble of terror, the fragility of life in my hands, and I knew then that this moment defined me, that the wolf in my blood, the starlight of my veins, the courage and fire of my heart, all converged here, now, in a single pulse of defiance, and I held that defiance like a shield, invisible yet impenetrable, standing between him and the threat, and I could feel the pack's energy shift, some stepping forward, some recoiling, some whispering, some murmuring prayers or curses or awe, and I realized the division was forming, a fault line ripping through the loyalty of the pack. Hearts pulled between tradition and truth, fear and honor, cruelty and mercy, and I felt the eyes of the elders burning into me, measuring, calculating, and yet even their gazes could not sway the resolve that pulsed in my veins, the determination that flared in my chest, the fire that erupted from the pendant and the blood in my hand, and the wolf awakening within. And I felt Kaelin's hand brush briefly against mine, a tether, a grounding force, a silent promise of support, and I knew he would protect me if I could not protect myself. Yet I did not step back, did not relinquish my courage, did not falter in the face of the impossible, and as Ronan barked orders, calling for the execution, for the betrayal, for compliance, I felt the surge of life in me, the pulse of starlight and blood, the wolf coiling, the heart roaring, and I stepped fully in front of Daniel, chest forward, voice loud, unyielding, defiant, declaring again that mercy was strength, compassion was power, life was sacred, and the murmurs of awe and fear rippled through the pack like waves across water. And Darian's eyes softened, his arms shifting slightly, ready to protect, ready to support, ready to follow courage when reason might falter. And I felt the pull of the prophecy settle around me, binding me to destiny, binding me to the wolf, to Kaelen, to the choice I had made in that heartbeat of defiance, and as Ronan's jaw clenched tighter, as some wolves hissed and some knelt, as tension thickened like fog, I felt Daniel relax fractionally, trust flickering in his eyes, and I realized that my courage, raw and trembling, could save not just him, but ripple through the pack, showing them that power was not cruelty, strength was not fear, and that the girl with starlight in her veins could shape their world. And Kaelin's golden gaze never left me, molten and protective, and I felt the bond tighten, fierce and electric. And I stood there, chest heaving, hands trembling, wolf pulsing, heart blazing, the air alive with tension and possibility. And I knew the pack was splitting, hearts divided, faith tested, loyalty questioned, and yet I did not falter, did not shrink, did not betray what I knew was right. And as Ronan hissed, eyes blazing, lips drawn tight, I felt the pulse of destiny in my veins, the fire of courage, the weight of the wolf and human and starlight, and I pressed closer to Daniel, every heartbeat a drumbeat of defiance, every breath a flame of mercy, every pulse a promise that cruelty would not triumph. And I realized in that moment, with the pack divided, the wolf coiling in my blood, the pendant warm against my chest, and Kaelen molten and fierce at my side, that this was the true trial, the apex of fear and courage, and I was alive in every sense, trembling, terrified, exhilarated, yet utterly unbroken. And I would stand, I would protect, I would choose compassion, and nothing, no threat, no fear, no shadow could sway me from that truth. And the air around us crackled with the power of the moment, tension stretching taut like a bowstring, destiny and morality intertwining in a single pulse. And I knew that this moment would echo far beyond this chamber, far beyond the night, that every choice I made now would shape the future of wolves and humans, Kaelen and me, Daniel and the pack, and I stood trembling, wolf coiled, chest heaving, hands clenched around life and courage, as the trial of compassion reached its apex, and the room held its breath, waiting for the impossible, waiting for the courage to win. And I realized, with a shiver of fear, fire, and hope, that I was ready, utterly alive, and that this trial would define not just my fate, but the fate of all who watched, and I would not falter, would not bend, would not break. The moment I saw Darian's eyes shift, the hardness melting ever so slightly into something I could not yet name, a spark of hope ignited in my chest, a pulse of light in the dark aftermath of the trial of compassion, and my heart hammered, as the tension in the chamber hung like a living thing, thick and suffocating, and I realized that the scarred warrior, who had once despised my presence, who had scowled and judged and doubted, was now standing beside me in silent support, his posture shifting, stance firm, yet protective, and I felt a tremor of relief and disbelief coil through me, warm and wild, like the first stirrings of dawn after a long night, and I saw the subtle ripple through the pack, whispers passing from wolf to wolf, cautious, wary, then murmurs of approval and curiosity, eyes shifting, heads nodding, allegiance beginning to fracture in Ronan's absence of control, and I felt the pulse of power from the pendant at my chest, thrumming with the silver light of starlight and blood, a tether to the wolf within me, a reminder that courage and compassion could indeed sway even the hardest hearts, and I noticed Kaelen's gaze on me, molten and golden, simmering with pride and something far deeper, something fierce and unspoken, and I shivered, a mix of fear, exhilaration, and longing, as the Alpha King, my tether and protector, moved with a fluid grace to intercept Ronan's whispered threats, body coiled and ready, yet restrained by the fragile line between authority and loyalty, and I realized then that Kaelen's trust was now fully mine, that the boy Daniel's life was in my hands, entrusted by the pack's fiercest leader, and my chest tightened with the weight of responsibility, yet my heart surged with a bold, wild certainty, and I knew I would not falter, could not falter, not now, not ever, as the pack's eyes rested on me, expectation and fear interwoven, and Darian's presence, solid and scarred, reinforced my resolve, a silent vow mirrored in his dark, calculating gaze. And I stepped forward, arms instinctively reaching to steady Daniel, whose small body trembled, and I whispered for him to trust me, to breathe, to follow, and he met my eyes, hesitant yet desperate, hope flickering in the midst of terror, and the path forward stretched long, uncertain, shadowed by danger yet brightened by the silver pulse of destiny thrumming through me, and I felt the stirrings of the wolf within, coiling and raw, a quiet growl vibrating in my chest, tethered to my intent, my courage, my desire to protect. And the pack's murmurs continued, shifting like wind through leaves, some leaning forward, some recoiling, some whispering approval, some skepticism, and I realized the tide was turning, slowly, inevitably, the momentum of my defiance, of my compassion, changing hearts as surely as moonlight transforms night. And I took Daniel's hand, small and fragile, feeling the tremor in his grip, and led him with careful steps through the clearing, each movement deliberate, each glance measuring the wolves' distance and intent. And I sensed Kaelen's golden gaze never leaving me, a molten tether of protection, unyielding and fierce, and yet not overbearing, giving me room to lead, to act, to claim responsibility, and I felt a thrill, a shiver of intimacy and respect, that he saw me as equal, as worthy, as something more than human prey, and my chest tightened, warmth pooling in my stomach, as the air shimmered with the lingering energy of the trial of compassion, silver light still dancing in my veins, and the pack shifted subtly, the murmurs rising and falling, wolves following Darian's lead, heads high, alert, obedient yet curious, and I felt a surge of pride and caution, knowing that any misstep could fracture the fragile allegiance, yet exhilaration coiled tight in me, fire and fear and courage intertwined, and I guided Daniel slowly, speaking softly, Rias, stirring him with every step, whispering words of safety and hope, while the forest beyond the keep's walls stretched dark and endless, shadows twisting, yet familiar with the rhythm of wolf and human, predator and protector, destiny and choice, and I felt Kaelen step slightly closer, presence molten, silent, a tether and a shield, and the warmth of him brushed against my arm, subtle but electric, as if the universe itself acknowledged the bond forming in that tension-soaked moment. And I realized that the weight of trust, of responsibility, of life, of destiny, now rested heavily on me, coiled and pulsing in every heartbeat, every nerve, every flicker of the wolf inside me. Yet I did not falter. could not falter, and I felt Daniel's small hand clutch mine tighter, a lifeline, fragile yet trusting, and the path stretched onward, uncertain, dark, but alive with possibility, with the silver light of courage and prophecy guiding each step. And I felt Darian's shadowed gaze move over the pack, measuring, observing, approving silently, and the pack followed, some hesitantly, some with newfound purpose, the tide of loyalty shifting as courage and defiance carved a new path. And I felt Kaelin's eyes on me again, molten, protective, yet recognizing my agency, my strength, my worth, and the pulse of something deeper, magnetic, threading between us, unspoken yet undeniable, warmed my chest, made my heart thrum, and I realized that I was no longer the same girl who had entered Shadowpine Forest for a dying brother, trembling and terrified, but someone transformed, tempered in fire and silver light, wolf and human and starlight entwined, and the forest seemed alive, shadows moving, the air thick with energy, as I guided Daniel with careful steps, every nerve alight with focus, and every step solidified the bond, the trust, the unspoken respect growing between Kaelen and me, between the pack and me, and the silver pendant at my chest pulsed, heartbeat in rhythm with mine, wolf and girl, destiny and choice. And I knew that as we reached the edge of the clearing, the first tremors of a new allegiance had taken root. Darian's loyalty a spark, Kaelin's trust a flame, and I, Aria Hale, girl of starlight and wolf blood, had found the courage to guide life through fear, to carve a path of compassion through the shadows. And as the pack watched, murmurs shifting between awe and acceptance, I felt something I had never known, a pulse of belonging, fierce and electric, mingling with fear and hope. And I realized in that moment that the bond with Kaelen, molten and protective, the respect of Darian, and the fragile loyalty of the pack, had forged me anew, stronger, braver, alive with the silver fire of starlight and courage. And I was ready, trembling, exhilarated, terrified, yet utterly unbroken, to face whatever came next, knowing I had claimed my place, not as human, not as prey, but as something greater, equal, and entirely my own. The forest stretched before us, dark and twisted, shadows pooling like ink under the dim light of the moon, and Daniel's small hand trembled in mine, his grip tight yet hesitant, as we navigated the gnarled roots and jagged rocks, and I could feel every whisper of wind, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, pulse through me like an electric charge, reminding me of the peril surrounding us, the danger that lurked in every shadow. And I whispered softly to him, urging him forward, assuring him with my voice, though my own heart hammered like a drum. And yet even in the fear, I felt the warmth of my mother's silver pendant against my chest, a gentle pulse of light, a reminder of her love, her guidance, her presence threading through me like silver fire, and I imagined her voice, soft and sure, telling me to trust myself, to embrace my blood, to walk the path she had walked before me, to honor both worlds she had loved. And the thought steadied me, even as the forest seemed to tighten, oppressive and watchful, yet alive with unseen eyes, with predator instincts that tested every nerve. And I could feel Daniel's breath quicken, ragged with fear, and I squeezed his hand, murmuring, "We'll make it. We have to keep moving, just a little further." And the words felt hollow, yet powerful, carrying hope into the darkness, and my wolf stirred inside me, coiling, raw, sensing the danger before it appeared, instincts sharpening, senses flaring, every nerve alight, and I felt the forest itself pulse with tension, every shadow a potential threat, every gust of wind carrying whispers of past lives, of Celine's love, of my destiny entwined with both human and wolf. And I pressed forward, stepping carefully over roots, over rocks, listening to every crackle, every snap, every whisper of movement in the dark. And then, as if the forest itself had been holding its breath, Ronan's forces emerged, shadows peeling from the trees, eyes gleaming with malice, teeth bared, claws glinting, and my chest tightened, fear and fury coiling together, and Daniel froze, eyes wide with terror, and I wrapped my arm around him instinctively, wolf pulsing, silver light thrumming from my pendant as if sensing the threat. And the world seemed to slow, every heartbeat echoing in my ears, every breath a drawn-out note of tension, and I realized I could not falter, could not allow them to harm him, could not allow fear to control me, and I felt the surge of my wolf blood awaken fully, coiling and raw, a stunning pulse of power that shot through my veins, making the hair on my arms stand, making my heart pound in sync with my instincts, and the air itself seemed to tremble, charged with the energy of life and fury, and I bared my teeth, low growl vibrating in my chest as the first of Ronan's wolves lunged, eyes gleaming with predatory hunger, claws reaching, and I met them with every ounce of strength, every surge of silver energy, feeling it explode from my pendant, my blood, my wolf, and the power knocked them back, staggering, growling, confusion flashing in their eyes as the raw force of my awakening struck. And Daniel pressed close, trembling, eyes wide, and I murmured, "Stay close, trust me." And the words carried more weight than I could explain, and I felt the pull of destiny, of heritage, of the wolf within me, and I let it guide my movements, every step calculated, every growl a weapon, every surge of power a shield for him. And the forest seemed to bend around me, shadows twisting, roots and trees recoiling as if afraid of the force I wielded, and yet even as my body coiled with power, my mind raced with strategy, guiding Daniel, sensing openings, avoiding ambushes, calling on instincts I had never known, and I felt the whispers of my mother's spirit, steady, calming, guiding, reminding me that love and courage were stronger than fear, that destiny was not only blood and power, but choice, mercy, and protection, and I pressed forward, weaving through the trees, dodging claws, countering attacks, feeling every leap, every strike, every motion in the air and underfoot, and Ronan's voice rang out, sharp and furious, cursing, ordering, demanding, yet even his words could not pierce the surge of power that hummed in me, and Darian's presence behind me, though absent in person, lingered in spirit, his earlier shift a reminder that loyalty could change, that courage could inspire, that fear could bend to purpose, and I felt my chest swell with the raw, pulsing truth of who I was, wolf blood and human, starlight in veins, protector of life, and Daniel's small hand tightened in mine, eyes wide, trusting, and together we ran, dodging, weaving, leaping, heartbeats syncing with the pulse of the forest and the silver fire in me. And the ambush pressed, yet my power held, deflecting, shielding, surging, wolf-coiled energy blasting through, knocking them back with force, the air shimmering with tension, light, and fury, and I felt a thrill, sharp, terrifying, and exhilarating. Thus so. If fear and power intertwined, every movement a dance of life and death, every breath a thread of destiny. And as we ran, I whispered to Daniel, encouraging, calming, a lifeline of human warmth amidst the raw energy. And the wolves faltered, hesitation creeping into their ranks as they sensed my awakening, my blood, my resolve, and the pendant's silver pulse flared, bright and steady, anchoring me, reminding me of Celine, of love, of courage, and I realized then that this moment, this survival, this protection of life was my true awakening, not the ritual, not the trial, but the surge of power and mercy entwined, the wolf and human coexisting, guiding, protecting, shaping destiny, and I felt the air vibrate, the forest alive, the path forward open yet dangerous, and Kaelen's presence, molten and protective, seemed to shadow me even now, a tether of trust, an unspoken bond, and I pressed forward, surging through the ambush, dodging, striking, protecting Daniel, heart and wolf and starlight aligned, and the forest seemed to acknowledge me, the silver pulse from the pendant, the fire of my blood, the awakening of power blending with purpose, guiding each step, each leap, each breath, and the shadows of Ronan's wolves fell back, uncertainty creeping into their ranks, and I felt Daniel's small hand clutch mine tighter, trust and relief blooming in his eyes, and I whispered again, "We're almost there. Keep moving. You're safe with me." And the words carried the weight of my awakening, of courage and mercy, and we pressed on through the darkened forest, every rustle, every snap, every whisper of leaves a test, a challenge, yet we moved together, unstoppable, the wolf and human entwined, the silver pulse of destiny blazing, and I realized that I had claimed this path, that I was no longer just a girl fleeing fear, but a protector, a guide, a bridge between worlds, heart and bee. Lude and starlight aligned, and even as exhaustion gnawed at me, even as fear and adrenaline battled, I felt a clarity, a power, a purpose that surged, that shaped every step, every heartbeat, every breath, and I would not fail, would not falter, would not let darkness claim the life in my hands. And the forest, alive with tension and silver light, seemed to part around us, guiding us, and I realized in that surge of awakening wolf blood and human courage that this was only the beginning. Yet I was ready, trembling, exhilarated, alive, utterly unbroken, and Daniel and I moved forward, destiny pulsing in every heartbeat, silver light blazing, wolf and girl and starlight entwined, and the return through Shadowpine was ours, perilous yet triumphant, fear and courage coiled together, and I knew we would survive, and I knew the bond with Kaelen and the wolf within me would guide every step beyond this night. The gates of Moonvale Keep rose before me, familiar yet transformed in my eyes, shadows stretching long beneath the crimson moon, and I stepped through them, feeling the pulse of destiny still thrumming in my veins, the silver fire of my blood and pendant still warm, alive, resonating with the wolf within me. And as the forest's shadows gave way to the open courtyard, the pack's eyes turned toward me, a mixture of awe, caution, curiosity, and respect, and I realized I was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled into Shadowpine Forest, trembling and desperate, but someone tempered by trials, by fire, by silver light and blood and courage, and I felt Kaelin's presence like molten gold at my back, golden eyes soft yet fierce, radiating protection and something far deeper, something intimate. Something that made my pulse spike with warmth and a wild, thrilling electricity, and my steps felt steady, deliberate, each one echoing in the quiet tension of anticipation that stretched across the pack, every gaze fixed, every muscle taut, and I drew a breath that trembled with relief and exhilaration, the weight of trials behind me, yet the gravity of destiny ahead. And as Kaelen stepped beside me, his hand brushing mine, molten heat radiating, I felt the bond between us tighten, unspoken yet undeniable, and he turned to me with that fierce golden gaze, eyes burning with unrestrained emotion, and whispered, almost breathless, "I can't control myself, not when it comes to you." And a shiver ran through me, heart pounding, wolf coiling, pulse racing with desire and awe and love, and I felt every beat of his words sink deep, anchoring me, thrilling me, a tether and a promise, and I raised my chin, chest swelling, letting my presence speak for me, letting my courage, my transformation, my wolf blood, my starlight in my veins, shine forth. And the pack murmured, some kneeling, some whispering, others watching with wide eyes as Kaelin's hand closed around mine in a gesture of partnership, of equality, of love, and I felt my heart swell, a tidal wave of emotion, relief, pride, exhilaration, and longing all at once. And the prophecy, the whispers of destiny, the silver fire of my mother's pendant, everything aligned in that heartbeat, that single, perfect, devastating moment. And I realized that I was no longer torn between worlds, no longer a girl fearing the shadows of the forest, but a bridge, a beacon, a wolf-blooded human, fully alive, fully powerful, fully myself, and the pack's murmurs grew, some rising into applause, some low howls of acknowledgement, a chorus of acceptance, and I felt Darian standing close, scarred and solemn, respect and pride radiating from him, and others who had doubted now followed his lead, loyalty shifting, hearts bending toward courage. And I felt the warmth of Kaelin's fingers entwining with mine, a silent claim, a claim of equality, of partnership, of unspoken vows, and I raised my eyes to meet his, molten and molten gold and molten fire, and the world seemed to hold its breath, the crimson moon casting its light across the courtyard, shadows flickering, silver fire lingering in my veins, and I knew that the moment was perfect, fragile yet unstoppable, destiny fulfilled yet only beginning. And I felt Daniel's gaze meet mine briefly, a grateful, relieved, trusting look that made my chest swell, a reminder of why I had fought, why I had survived, why I had become who I was, protector, bridge, wolf, and human and starlight intertwined, and Kaelin's voice, low, molten, fierce, brushed against my ear, a whisper that ignited a thrill deep in my chest. We've both found our place, together. And I trembled, a mix of awe, exhilaration, and desire, wolf coiling, heart racing, every nerve alive, and I felt the pack's energy shift, some leaning forward, some murmuring, some stepping closer, some watching, all drawn into the gravity of what had been accomplished, and I realized the power of compassion, courage, love, and destiny, the force that had carried me through fire, blood, and trial, and I pressed closer to Kaelen, hand in his, letting the molten warmth of his presence anchor me, steady me, thrill me, and the air shimmered with silver light, with life, with purpose, with hope, and I felt the pulse of unity, of belonging, of love, of wolf and human and starlight entwined, and Kaelin's golden gaze softened, molten fire settling into molten warmth, and he pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to the back of my hand, a claim, a vow, a promise that made my knees tremble, and I realized in that moment, surrounded by the pack, the keep, the silver light of destiny, the crimson moon, that I had found not only love but home, not only courage but belonging, and the prophecy, once a shadowy threat, now stood fulfilled, not with destruction but with bridge, not with cruelty but with compassion, not with fear but with courage, and I felt the weight of all I had endured, all I had survived, all I had become, settle into my bones, tempered, radiant, alive, and I pressed my hand tighter into Kaelin's, a silent agreement, a promise of partnership, of unity, of love, and the pack, watching, murmuring, some howling, some bowing, some whispering, acknowledged it, their future shifting, hearts aligning with courage and hope, and I felt the stirrings of joy, relief, love, and fire surge through me, wolf and human and starlight entwined, and Kaelin's hand tightened around mine, eyes molten, voice low, intimate, almost trembling. You're mine, as I am yours. And I shivered, exhilarated, trembling, heart racing, wolf coiling, pulse thrumming, and I knew then that everything had led to this moment, the trials, the blood, the prophecy, the fear, the courage, the love and destiny, and I would never be the girl who feared the shadows again, never alone, never torn, never without purpose. And as the moon cast its crimson light across us, across the courtyard, across the pack, I realized that the wolves, the humans, the forest, the prophecy, all were threads woven into a tapestry I now fully embraced. And Kaelen leaned close, his molten warmth brushing my cheek, a whisper, a pulse, a promise, and I trembled, utterly alive, utterly unbroken, utterly home, and together we faced the future, hearts entwined, blood and starlight and wolf blood blazing, and the air shimmered with the energy of unity, courage, love, and destiny, and I realized that in his hand, in my hand, in the pulse of the pack and the fire of the moon, I had found my place, my purpose, my love, my home, my destiny fully embraced beneath the crimson moon, wolf and human and starlight entwined, alive, unstoppable, unbroken, and finally free.